Thank you very much. It is an honor as well as a great privilege to be able to speak to you and to be part of this forum at these critical times. Before I start, I should mention that I've just learned that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was well known, I think, to many of us, President Carter's National Security Advisor, has recently died. And I'm sure all of us would like to pass our condolences to his family. For me personally, and my wife Rebecca, who is with me, coming again to Riga is a great and particular pleasure. I first came to Riga when I was a junior diplomat at our embassy in Moscow in the winter of 1962. And I was able then at that period, during, you might say, Soviet history, to witness the remarkable spirit of the Latvians at that time. I actually attended the Latvian theater where a play was being produced about Joan of Arc, actually, and yet it was also about Latvia under occupation. And one could certainly sense that in the population. I came again to Latvia in 1986 to a conference in Jūrmala, when I was able to point out to many that the United States had never recognized the legal incorporation of the three Baltic countries in the Soviet Union. You know, I had learned earlier that that fact was not well understood in many of the people here. Well, we negotiated an end to the Cold War, and quite separate from that, subsequently, the Soviet Union broke up. The three Baltic countries regained their independence, actually with the approval of the Soviet Congress of People's Deputies in 1991, so that the three Baltic countries became independent even before the rest of the Soviet Union broke up. I think this is something we do need to remember now. And as one who was taking part in that history, let me just say parenthetically that I felt that throughout the, you might say, the liberation struggle of the late 1980s and 1990 and 91, I had the feeling that under enormous political pressure, Mikhail Gorbachev was doing his best to prevent a suppression of the Baltic states. Well, we ended the Cold War, and when I left government service at the end of 1991, we had, maybe for the first time in history, a Europe whole and free, and yet not yet a structure to continue that. And since we have seen developing a relationship which to many people resembles that of the Cold War in tensions. I think the current tensions are quite different. The Cold War was really about communism and the conflict between communism and the rest of the world. That is not an issue today. And I think that what we see on both sides are prevailing narratives which are, both of which are incorrect. On the one hand, you have an assumption in Western Europe and the United States that we won the Cold War, that that was a quasi-military or economic achievement, that the Soviet Union collapsed because of that, and so on. And in the East, particularly in Russia, one has the idea that somehow they were misled toward the end of the Cold War, and that the West brought pressure to break up the Soviet Union. Both of these narratives are incorrect. We negotiated an end to the Cold War to the benefit of all parties, Every agreement that General Secretary and then President Gorbachev made was in the interest of the Soviet Union, as it was in the rest of us. The Cold War ended before the Soviet Union broke up, and the Soviet Union broke up because of internal pressures, not because of external pressure. So why do we have this assumption today on both sides that somehow we're naturally enemies? I think most of that is simply the basis of a mistake in understanding history, and often a misinterpretation of moves that each side has made. We have forgotten, I believe, one of the basic principles that allowed us to end the Cold War. In their very first meeting, President Reagan and then General Secretary Gorbachev made an important agreement and statement. It was a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. They recognized the responsibility that the possession of nuclear weapons, in the quantity of which at that time the United States and the Soviet Union, and even today the United States and Russia has, imposes upon us a particular responsibility. Frankly, it seems to me when we talk about the tensions today, we have forgotten that. A nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and therefore there can be no war between us. So why all this maneuvering? Why the buildup of military forces on both sides? It is simply irresponsible. And I think we have to recognize this. So what do we do about it? And one of the things I think our political leadership in NATO and in Russia must insist that our military leaders begin talking again. We need to revive the NATO-Russia agreement, and each side talk openly to the other about what activities they find irritating, and let's knock them off. Because the basic fact is the threats to our security are common. First of all, and most important, the only immediate existential threat, not only to our countries, but to humanity, are these nuclear weapons. And the United States and Russia have over 90% of them. We must not forget that. And we must not forget that that means that military competition between us and military conflict is impermissible. And I was to some degree encouraged when Secretary Tillerson, after his first meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov and President Putin, stated that it is impermissible for the current tensions between the United States and Russia to continue in their form. I think that is a basic truth. Now, when you think about it, the basic interests, not only in the Baltic area, but in Europe and in the world as a whole, the basic interests between Europe, the United States, and Russia are, if not identical, are consistent. As I said before, the main thing is to continue the process of controlling and eliminating, eventually, these nuclear weapons, which are a threat to mankind. Second, we have looming ahead in a few decades the problems of global warming. We have the current problems of terrorism, the current problems of dealing with failed states, the current problems of trying to bring a better economic health to the world. These are common problems. Not a single one is going to be solved by military action or military conflict. Not a single one is going to be solved by any one or group of our countries if we don't cooperate. That's the challenge before us, and I think that's what I hope the people at this forum and our colleagues elsewhere will be concentrating on as we look forward. Thank you very much.